So my name is Adam Konner. I'm the organizer of R Credits, which is a non-cryptocurrency that I talked about this morning. But here we are talking about blockchains. The blockchain is a fascinating feat of cryptographic engineering. Essentially, a blockchain is a distributed database, but fundamentally, it's about digital property and decentralization. It enables an irrevocable transfer of digital property from one person to another without requiring a central authority. So there's no head that can be cut off. It's also the technology behind Bitcoin, which has made a lot of waves in the past few years. Bitcoin was the first cryptocurrency applying the blockchain concept to money. Bitcoin enables online payments and money transfers without a trusted authority. No governments, no banks, no intermediaries, no central server. But let's be clear, there is nothing cooperative or democratic about Bitcoin. Like so many so-called revolutions, Bitcoin simply replaces one power structure with another highly overlapping one. In this case, the power goes to the people with the resources and inclination to put expensive computer equipment to work mining Bitcoin. Co-ops are about democratic control. Bitcoin is fundamentally uncontrollable, and that's its point. You can't have democratic control of something that's uncontrollable. All that said, I'm sure you can all imagine situations where not being able to be stopped could be an important strength for a social movement. Blockchains are being used to decentralize power in many situations where power is concentrated, like contracts, data storage, even ride-sharing with Lazuz. And I'm excited to hear from these panelists about some new ways blockchains are being used to promote democracy. I will let them introduce themselves. So without further ado, here is Rachel O'Dwyer.
Can you hear me okay like this, or do I need to hold it? Okay. No? You need me to hold the... This isn't very loud, actually. You need me to hold this? Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Is this working? Yeah. It is, okay. All right, so... so I said I'd introduce myself. So I'm a researcher who's based in Dublin, doing work around the political economy of communications, and more recently work about payment infrastructure, and I'm also a member of the Peer-to-Peer Foundation, where I do work of that kind as well. And I've just been so inspired by the different projects I've seen over the last day or two in platform cooperativism, particularly around the blockchain. But that said, I also feel like there's quite a lot of tension in terms of speaking about the blockchain today as a possibility for platform cooperativism, where kind of most of the well-articulated examples we're seeing are much closer to some kind of venture capitalism than venture communism. So even though there's a lot of great imaginaries about that, and also because the scale of adoption of new kinds of blockchain technologies, the time frame of that is so fast. So we're seeing kind of very, very short amount of time from when something has a certain amount of interpretive flexibility to when it seems to be being enclosed. And so I guess today what I want to speak about is some of the possibilities then of a blockchain for platform cooperativism, but also maybe look to some of the things that we need to consider. So in relation to kind of platform cooperativism, what sort of problems do we imagine the blockchain solving, but also what kinds of maybe visions of politics or the state or democracy are we imagining into the blockchain? And what are their implications? But I said I would do just a very, very brief overview of the blockchain, just in case some people are here because they're just curious and they want to know a little bit more. So the way I'd explain it, just in a nutshell, is that a blockchain is basically, it's a time-stamped ledger. So it's just a ledger technology that's being shared by all peers within a network. So everyone has access to that ledger. So the innovation comes from Bitcoin, where the information on the ledger had to do with monetary transactions. So each transaction on Bitcoin was collected into a block, and that formed then a blockchain. But in order for a block to be added to the blockchain, so a block of transactions to be added, they have to be authenticated. And that kind of verification process then is produced by all computers within the network. So it basically involves comparing subsequent or previous transactions to verify that users are actually in possession of the money that they say they are, and doing that using this kind of computationally expensive but otherwise pretty useless calculation called a proof of work. And this then basically contributes to the authentication of the different transactions. And that's also how Bitcoin, how money is actually produced. So users who contribute some CPU to that authentication process can also be rewarded in Bitcoin. So it's basically a ledger then that's being shared on all the computers. But while I suppose the blockchain then is the primary innovation of the Bitcoin protocol, because it's allowing people who don't know or trust each other necessarily to cooperate, to transact, and to collaborate in a network. There's a huge amount of other applications that we're seeing coming to the fore from this blockchain technology. I think I might be able to put this down. Is that too far away? That's good. Okay, great. So, yeah, I mean, the innovations of Bitcoin, if you read the white paper, are that it's on one hand, there's a trustless database being described, and then there's a system, kind of a transactivity system for sending value from place to place. So people are now speculating about the applications of this trustless database to other kinds of applications outside of monetary transactivity. So whether that's maybe managing new kinds of property, distributed infrastructures, worker co-ops, some of the proposals that we've seen, innovations that are sometimes called blockchain 2.0 because they're not directly maybe concerned with cryptocurrencies. So initiatives like Ethereum, which you've probably all come across, were about extending then the possibilities of the Bitcoin script to basically produce a Turing-complete programming language so that you could build a Web 3.0 or a whole variety of different applications then on top of this blockchain protocol. The applications that we've seen today, though, mostly tend to involve things like contracts or new kinds of digitization of physical assets or digital assets, new kinds of rules. So maybe shifting from money towards law. And then we've projects, obviously, which we're going to hear from, things like Backfeed, which are developing much needed user interfaces on top of this. So I wanted to ask, what kind of problems maybe do we imagine the blockchain solving in terms of cooperation, in terms of trust and authentication, ownership, and also things like expropriation. So you've probably heard already over the course of the last day or two about this idea of the distributed collaborative organization or a decentralized autonomous organization. So where these distributed ledgers, like the ones that Ethereum have allowed, they can support and scale new kinds of distributed forms of cooperation on a global scale that's compatible with commons-based peer production. So where it was maybe quite difficult to scale those kinds of interactions beyond the local, this is a technology that potentially actually facilitates that. This is because it facilitates, I suppose, what we call trust among people that we don't necessarily know. So there's algorithmic tools then that actually foster trust in the absence of things that are usually necessary for trust, such as that things like social capital, or like I know you, or like we're physically kind of located in the same place, or we're depending on some kind of trusted third party. So this is sometimes, as I said, called like the trust web as well. So it's describing new kinds of applications that weave network value and consensus into the protocol itself. So this is a quote actually from that article just I was showing there, which says, trust, rules, identity, reputation, and payment choices are actually embedded at the peer level, and participants arrive already trusted and decentrally acknowledged. So when we're speaking about trust, I suppose it's this question maybe of authentication. So basically because of the fact that the database is public and that it can't be easily sort of faked, that we can see, or we can believe that, you know, the people we transact with are what they say, or that they're going to do what they do, because actually the rules and conditions of that can't really be disrupted easily, and because they're often hard-coded into the system. So what we're seeing then is that this is being used obviously for financial transactions, but also to produce, you know, new kinds of transparency as well. So there's been proposals for actually, you know, using the blockchain in relation to partner states to kind of see how maybe funding is happening, and where funding is being distributed. So making governing processes more transparent. So as well as this, this idea has sometimes been described as, this was a quote taken from kind of a workshop I was involved in a couple of months ago, where there was somebody from Intel, and I actually don't have his name because I just wrote it down in a notebook, but I thought this was a kind of a good quote of what the blockchain does in relation to that. So it's producing a persistent state for the internet, where so we have a database that kind of remains constant as long as people are interested anyway in supporting it. The second point then, I suppose, in relation to this idea of trust is consensus, and that this allows, you know, produces frameworks where we can all agree, leading to, I suppose, quotations like this, where in its purest form, blockchain is democracy. And then, yeah, I'm pretty sure the guys are going to go through some of this in relation to actually applied projects. So just very quickly then, you know, the idea is that we can produce, you know, not only new kinds of financial transactions, but also new ways of managing property. So maybe some kind of decentralized Dropbox as being one example, new kinds of voting systems, new kinds of transparency, and so on. And that there's also new kinds of incentives being built into the protocol, which kind of encourage people to cooperate and to give their time. I was going to talk through examples, but I actually think I might switch over. This is to do with some anxiety I have about speaking about the blockchain, because it feels like there's something a little bit trendy about the blockchain at the moment that makes me feel sometimes uncomfortable speaking about it, because there's so many speculative projects. And I feel like I've gone from feeling uncomfortable about that, though, to thinking that it's actually quite exciting, because even if some of these projects that we're seeing or imaginaries of what the blockchain can do don't actually come to anything, they tell us something significant about people's imaginaries of the kinds of cooperation that they want to see and the kind of problems that they see. So in some ways, I actually think it's a really, really interesting point. If you think back to maybe the history of something like the radio spectrum or the history of radio, that in that early stage you have all these different imaginaries of what communication would look like. And I think in the same way we could have a sort of a media archaeology of what we imagine cooperation or network cooperation will look like through all these different proposals for the blockchain. But what I wanted to finish with was actually looking at maybe some of the considerations or problems that we have with the blockchain, or with this idea. So the one I suppose that comes to the foremost is, the fact that most of the well-articulated versions we're seeing have nothing to do with platform cooperativism. They're actually about instituting new forms of automatic credit clearing and asset management between private banks. So I just came from Money 2020 in Las Vegas, and there was a huge focus around that. The other is obviously new kinds of digital rights management. So Everledger being, I think, one of the more successful applications that we're seeing on the blockchain. So it's about actually producing new kinds of private property, ones that are maybe actually more flexible or unfettered, and therefore maybe a little bit scarier, and obviously introducing new kinds of artificial scarcity around things like information, knowledge, and culture. So I think that's quite worrying. But the thing I really wanted to look at, I guess, is maybe what are some of the visions of the state of democracy, of subjectivity or politics that are being imagined by the blockchain, and maybe, you know, should we think about this a little bit more? So the first, I suppose, is this idea of trust in the code. So there's a lot of talk about how the blockchain allows for new kinds of trust, but in the development of these consensus algorithms, there's an implication that we can actually delegate a lot of the messiness of human social relationships to a form of algorithmic governance. So the claim is that not that we're going to engineer new kinds of trust, like new kinds of trust between friends necessarily, or institutions, or new trust between citizens and the state, but that we can actually dispense with that altogether in favour of some kind of a trust in the code. And I suppose you see that that's kind of clear maybe in the Bitcoin white paper. Just, it's about a system for transactions that is trustless, that doesn't rely on any kind of trust. And for me, this is maybe is a little bit worrying, because it's, I suppose, the idea that we're dispensing with the state or communities and replacing that with code. And that some of the blockchain imaginaries that we're seeing then begin from that assumption that there's no trust and there's no community. There's only these individual competitive economic agents who are acting in self-interest. I'd say that's very much like Elinor Ostrom's model, maybe, of the commons in some ways. So it's kind of presuming that we're economic subjects and beginning from that assumption. Basically asking, how do we build commons while presuming some kind of a neoliberal subject? And maybe what we need to do is imagine other kinds of subjects outside of this kind of economic, competitive, rational agent. And actually, this came up in a panel yesterday, not specifically this piece, but just this point where Frank Pasquale said in a discussion part of a panel yesterday that maybe if monetary reform in the 19th century was about removing politics from money, that what we're seeing with the blockchain is maybe that there's some kind of delegation or technical depoliticization happening. So we could argue that the blockchain in some ways isn't a radical alternative to some of the problems of governance or governmentality, but it's actually an instrument of that governmentality. So it's designed to not to replace some liberal framework with a radical alternative, but actually to perfectly embody that incentive in some ways, because it's replacing politics with economics. So we could say that, in some ways the technical isn't political. It doesn't make new subjects. It actually it makes them disappear. So it's about this kind of example that I was looking at here is, it's a 17th century book called Political Arithmetic, which is about new kinds of algorithmic governance, for want of a better word, through mathematics. So reducing individuals basically to data points and using that as the model for governance. And that maybe we can position the blockchain then, if we want to think about it critically, we have to be aware of the kind of lineage of other technologies that dispensed with politics. But the thing is, we can't necessarily dispense with political subjects. This actually came up as well. So I've just come from Microsoft research where this woman, Mary Gray, is based. And she was looking at this idea of automation's last mile, that we might imagine that basically machine learning and algorithmic systems are dispensing with humans, but actually all of these systems require a huge amount of effective and boring and banal labor to keep going. So we're imagining maybe some kind of monster, neoliberal state, but underneath that there's a huge amount of sort of effective and interpersonal work that's taking place. And I think that was really clear yesterday with somebody like Maria del Carmen Arroyo, when she was speaking, that there are all these people on the ground within our, neoliberal imaginary of the state that are doing amazing work, and that isn't just going to be replaced by a blockchain. So those subjects aren't necessarily going anywhere. So just to finish then, these are very, very speculative, just a few ideas of maybe what could we consider outside of a blockchain, or outside, alternative, not alternative, but what do we maybe want to take into consideration as well, in terms of maybe allowing for other kinds of politics or democracy or subjects to come to the fore. So maybe we need more than consensus. So maybe we need a model of democracy that isn't just about agreeing, but actually allows for some kind of agonistic confrontation, I suppose, as Chantal Mouffe would say. So some kind of a disagreement, or something a little bit fuzzier than pure consensus. Similarly, maybe we need something other than strict accounting or accountability in our relationship with other people. So something that's, again, allowing for kind of a multiplicity of different kinds of relationships and different kinds of accountabilities. And we need, I suppose sorry, this is really bad clip art. I was trying to think of something that would show, that we need maybe to recognize all these other kinds of effective and human work that are still involved. And my critique isn't that people want to build blockchains. I'm really excited, and I'm a real fan of the blockchains. But just that my critique, I suppose, would be the idea that by designating or by designing, or designing for governance that we can that we're modeling or we're instantiating some kind of form of the social or the political that's ideal. So this is actually an interview I did for the Peer-to-Peer Foundation with a woman called Alison Powell, she does amazing work on things like open data. But we got talking about this idea of modeling for or designing for ideal forms of behaviour, and I just thought this was a really nice quote where she's basically saying, how do we maintain the legitimacy of social processes themselves without actually letting our technologies take too much of a role? How do we develop some kind of a humility as people who want to be involved maybe in social movements, that we learn from what non-technologists are also doing in that space and find new ways of working together? I'll leave it there.
Up next is Joel Dietz.
So I've decided. Oh, okay. Great. So I've decided not to really talk about blockchain. I mean, I'm going to talk about blockchain, but I think the real important concept here is trust and the trust web and what brings humans together and what enables collaboration. And blockchain, as I see it, is one potential tool that's particularly good when there's low trust situations. So, if we were to say, hey, there's a $100 bill lying on this table and we left it for the rest of the day, what's the likelihood that that $100 bill would still be there? That's a sort of low trust situation, because sooner or later there'll be some situation where no one's looking and someone will have a question, well, probably I could just take the $100 bill and be fine. And there are a lot of problems like that, and finance in particular is full of problems like that, and so is governance, and they tend to be really interesting problems, but they're by no means the only type of problems. Somewhat interestingly, on the topic of the trust web, I was thankful enough that the article about after the social web comes the trust web, I actually had a chance to contribute to that and help set some of the language in place. Because I really think that this is where the emphasis should be, and not necessarily on the technology itself or a lot of other things. So that's my own personal bias, but I also happen to be super inspired by natural systems, and particularly the beauty and emergent beauty that can happen. I know Matan is as well, and he had some slides up there. This is one I always like to use, because people are like, well, how does it happen? I actually had this really cool thing. There's an awesome National Geographic thing. It's on Netflix called Swarms. And it has all this really nice footage of all of these different sort of animals interacting. And then at the end, they're always like, and we have no idea how this happens, or why it happens. They just seem to do this and totally unexplained. But one really interesting field that is actually has nothing to do with technology at all is to a certain degree is a field of swarm intelligence, and the increasing knowledge that we do have of how natural systems work or don't work sometimes. And once you start getting into the details of it, there's some really interesting patterns that emerge. I think many people are probably familiar with Mandelbrot's work and kind of fractals that we find in nature and reoccurring patterns, and even the Pythagoreans and golden ratios and all that kind of stuff. But it's actually super interesting that behind it is a lot of, math. There's a couple different ways where nature sometimes uses different types of ledgers, if you want to call them that. There's direct incentivization, like how much money you have or how much food you have. It's obviously important for ants to eat too, but there's a lot of indirect ways that things are stimulated as well, of which pheromones and what I think Matan talked about a little bit this morning, stigmergy, are kind of employed. So there's a whole lot of like theoretical background that we can start to bring in to say how do like things cohere around trust, and like how might this impact how we start doing things once systems shift over to like being in this kind of way. This is like I've done a lot of presentations in the context of the decentralized autonomous society because, like Rachel was saying, we're like huge fans of Eleanor Ostrom's work. Like we just love her, and she comes up all the time. And so there's a lot of things that it's actually potentially way easier to like implement in this kind of context. And I just put these up. These are like traditional ways that you get trust. But there's like first of all, where do you need it? Well, kind of anytime there's scarce resources, so that's why you have like titles for land and people know who owns what land because, there's not an unlimited supply. And, stocks and property and other types of public goods too, often require that sort of thing. So what do you have to kind of create trust? Well, you have religion, ethics, kind of ethical norms that are circulated. You have competition and markets that are there. Sometimes you have trusted third parties. I would say government is really an example of a trusted third party that we say, we entrust you to protect like this land registry. And sometimes in United States, like we have a reasonable rule of law, not perfect, not incorruptible. But in many cases, in fact, some of the ones where blockchain has made some headway, they actually have extremely poor like land registries and things like that. So that's, and obviously in our own case, I think we can say relatively well that the banking system has not necessarily been particularly worthy of whatever trust we put into it. I like to understate things sometimes. So and then the go locals. This is the Ostrom. Like, how can you build this kind of like robust thing? And this is like where it starts to get really interesting. In my mind, and there's so much interesting theoretical literature, but I really can't go into all of it. But basically, a lot of people have written on these problems for a long time, and a lot of the stuff that they've written wasn't really that easy to implement before because, and this is like a kind of classic problem here, is it had to go through like the government or something else, and so a lot of these like local systems actually aren't like are harder to implement than like the top-down solutions, and that's like part of the reason why I got excited about all of this. This is my own kind of thing about blockchain on one slide. Won't really go into it per se. Actually, I think it's from one of Primavera's decks that I was like, oh, so good. So but like what really gets interesting is like, hey, look, we can do more complex behavior and kind of and all kinds of interesting things, within this blockchain context. So the first thing when I searched like smart contracts Ethereum, this was like last January, I wrote this distributed governance white paper. And it's actually like me sort of responding to things because I had been involved in cooperative things before. I'm involved in for-profit. I've been involved in other kinds of nonprofits. I founded a couple nonprofits and grew them to some size. And, and basically I said it seems like in a lot of projects there's an early need to have centralization to like make rapid decision making and have incentives that are there for people, but then a legitimate desire to have more people heard and kind of involved kind of as things evolve. So I don't know who was there for like the kind of Peers Inc. kind of talk earlier, but like, clearly like we want there to be incentives that like go and spread out, and we don't want all the value to be captured just by, a very small number of people either. So, and this is like basically, I was like super excited about this. But the kind of problem last January is that none of the platforms to actually do this existed, and they weren't going to be around for a long time. But like eventually, basically, this is like a year later. Us and a bunch of other really great legal scholars came together at Harvard, and this was this January, and said, "Hey, look, we can make this legal model here in the United States to make this all work." And that's where the distributed collaborative organization model came from. It's both a kind of way of structuring something, but also a legal wrapper around it to say, how can we actually make a partnership model kind of work within the context of the US legal system? I was particularly concerned because we had done almost all of the early innovation ourselves, and I really didn't want to get sued or go to jail, or like, you know, when you're doing these things, there's like all these regulatory authorities that might have jurisdiction over you, like the SEC and CFTC and FinCEN, and we'd done crowdfunding and the governance stuff and decentralized assets, and I just like, you know, particularly if I'm going out and recommending to other people, I don't want anyone to like have liability afterwards. So we got a lot of people, all the kind of best sort of legal scholars together in one room. This is what I came up with. And like, okay, so you know, going back and kind of rewinding a little bit, like why is this a big deal? I'm going to go super high speed through all this stuff, and maybe we can come back to it in questions, because I don't know, I just like to put a lot of information out there for everyone's benefit. But hey, like, you know, some of these, like, you know, first of all, there's different kind of problems in centralized networks and overall evolution. But like really, a lot of these new like distributed models are kind of outstripping and actually it's not just like, oh, we can involve more people and it's more democratic, which I do see as like a desirable thing, but they're actually just more resilient, more competitive, and actually potentially way more profitable as well. So, you know, like even though Twitter is not fully decentralized, it actually has a lot of elements, for example, of a decentralized sort of methodology about it, and open networks where anyone can join without registering them with themselves, and things like that that are kind of, so things have kind of been moving in that direction, and they happen to be, you know, really good at getting scale and kind of creating business opportunities. So this is kind of like evolution of a slide I showed a little bit in the thing I gave this morning, but, you know, one expert being involved, and then kind of evolution to kind of some a little more robust means. But basically, the more open the network is, kind of the more people you can involve, and then the more that things become user driven and the choices become something that like I set, here's what I care. And I think like, you know, Netflix, for those of you who use it, is a pretty good example of that, in the sense that you know, you can kind of set things, and other people, and then you can kind of get recommendations based on your own preferences. But this is going to get way better. Like with this blockchain, with open reputation networks, open all this stuff, this is like, you know, everything is going to, I think, move very strongly in this direction. Yeah, you know, personally, I've been involved in several projects that are doing things like this that I'm extremely enthusiastic about. So again, it kind of pays to be open. So there's like, you know, it's nice when there's kind of some value proposition behind it. And then it allows this thing called like emergence, which I just think is super cool, and among other things. But like a lot of people have written about this for a long time, but like full dynamic thing, like the way your brain works, like ideas coming up and, you know, going into action very quickly. And, you know, so much, for instance, of like the venture capital ecosystem or other things like that doesn't facilitate that. It doesn't facilitate that like fluidity that we do sometimes experience in other parts of life. So that's what I hope. I have some other stuff here just about like how applications are written and software and stuff like that. But I think like the actual implications are really massive, like because it's kind of like redoing the internet in this decentralized way, and then the way that you approach it is going to change. So this is like, you know, something from the book we're kind of putting out later this month. But like basically all these different things are possibilities attached to like smart contracts and blockchains, and they all have like different kind of ways of promoting. This was actually presented at the Ethereum DevCon earlier this last week. But yeah, there's like all kinds of things that kind of have to be rethought a little bit. And then, yeah, the ultimate result, I don't know, a giant decentralized brain. And then back to us. So like, I think Swarm, actually, my project is most famous for being a crowdfunding project. And that's partially because when I came around and I said, I want to create a just sustainable project to like build the future that I think we should have, and then who's going to fund me? And I just talked to VCs, it was super obvious, and then we're going to actually fund what I wanted to do and build this community stuff. So we built our own crowdfunding platform on top of blockchain in order to do this sale. And then we raised $1 million basically saying, look, we want to create this abundant network. And we've been moving forward. Most of the barriers have been regulatory, unfortunately, and then there have been some delays based on other kind of platforms that have taken a while to get going. But a year later, we have I think 8 officially launched projects that have come out and received some kind of momentum. Funds pretty heavily focused on community projects. And then, a lot of other people have sort of started to adopt this DCO, distributed collaboration model, whether they're officially with us or not, but, who are kind of out there and kind of see this as the future. And, with the crowdfunding stuff, to be honest, we're still waiting for a lot of clarity, and it's really expensive to talk to lawyers and deal with that stuff. And no matter how much money you seem to have, it doesn't seem to be enough. So that's always been a problem. And then, kind of really building out the fully featured version of that. So that's what the SwarmBot is. I don't have it up there, but swarmbot.io is kind of providing an access layer, not just to the crowdfunding stuff, but to all of those features. So, and that's what we've done. So, thanks.
Matan Field.
Hi everyone. So I'm pretty sure many of us are tired after lunch. I'll be really happy if we can make it a discussion. So if you have any question, if you just want to stand up or do yell or anything, just feel free to interrupt. So I didn't prepare slides, and I have plenty of topics to discuss, so I will be happy to follow the interest of people. So, yeah, please interrupt. Okay, so who feels he or she understand what the blockchain is? Raise your hand, please. Okay, pretty good. We are, I think, 50%. That's fine. So there many people are talking about the blockchain. But the problem, or if you want, the good thing, is that the blockchain is not a thing. The blockchain is a framework. It's a protocol that evolves to a protocol, to a more advanced protocol, and now we have thousands of them, and many different people call the same word for completely different stuff. However, all these protocols have something in common, and I will try to pinpoint that something so that we know what we mean by when we speak about a blockchain. So firstly, let me remind you about the Bitcoin. So Bitcoin has brought two, I would say, groundbreaking ideas. One of them was that we can hold a public ledger, okay, a database, a piece of information that we can all agree about, okay? Now this piece of information is dynamic. It is changing. It's not just a rigid copy that stays there forever, the same, with the same information. It's actually dynamic. It keeps evolving. The second thing, which is the second part of that idea, was the rules how to change that copy. And the rules were designed in two ways. One way to serve something, in this case, being a monetary system. So in that case, one way to change the rules is making transactions. That's one way to change database. And the second reason for that rules is to incentivize participation, and in particular bootstrapping. So building the first critical mass of participants before actually the network is working. And that's in a Bitcoin space called mining. So it's incentivizing participation and distributing tokens for early adoption. So these are the two ideas, the public ledger and the rules of the game. Okay? Since then, these two ideas have gone a great portion of evolution, and in particular Ethereum, which I think today is the state of the art of a blockchain today, or at least one of them, has basically generalized the first part. So they said, okay, why should we just have a database, a shared database? Why not having a shared computer, a shared software? So with Ethereum, not only you have a shared database, you can also have shared operating system. So anyone can deploy an application, anyone can use that application but no one can tamper with the application or change it. Well, you can change it if it's according to the set of rules that were designed to begin with. The second idea of if you want, of rules, how to change stuff, how to play together, this is what we in Backfeed basically generalize. So designing the governance mechanism for distributed networks to play with, no matter what is the game. So let me give you kind of the flavor of where things sit. So some people call some of the outcome of that, call them distributed applications or DApps, and some people call some of the outcomes DCOs, decentralized collaborative organizations. Now, what is the difference between those two? And I would like to argue that it's not binary. There is a continuum. There is a continuous spectrum from DApps to DCOs. So decentralized application is something that many nodes in the network are using in a decentralized manner. For example, Bitcoin. There are only two ways you can participate in the network. Either you are making transactions or you are mining, which means that you are verifying the transaction of others, and as a reward for that, you get tokens. So there is, in a way, there is a discrete, binary even, way to participate in the network. On the other edge of the spectrum, decentralized collaborative organization is, imagine the most general collaborative participation you can imagine. Basically, let's say that all of us right now, together in the room, have started to do a startup together. Anyone can contribute anything, whether it's code or ideas or design or money or whatever, and we can build on top of each other, distribute the value between all those co-creators, gain reputation, influence power, and so on. So this is decentralized collaborative organization. Now, in between those two, decentralized application and decentralized collaborative organization, there is a whole spectrum. For example, decentralized journalism, where it sits. Like anyone can upload content, anyone can edit others' content, anyone can publish, and so on. So it's not really decentralized application. It's not that discrete or binary, but it's also not that general for everything. So it's somewhere in between, and so on. So this is the space that is being developed gradually. Now, in addition to moving from application to collaboration, there is also a gradual movement from machine to human, the focus from machine to the focus on human. So for example, so far all decentralized application were focusing on actions which are quantifiable and measurable by machine. So blockchain by itself, Bitcoin blockchain is proof of work, which means that and you mentioned that, like how much you are important in the network depends on how much CPU basically you have in your computer. In a more modern version of blockchain, this is proof of stake and so on, but gradually you want to add more human interaction to that human layer, to that game, things that basically human can assess and algorithms cannot. For example, journalism. So, a human can assess the quality of the content, or whether it's decentralized coding clan, a human can assess the quality of a code, which machine cannot. And then it asks for the question, how do you assess, how do you evaluate other contribution in a decentralized way and still make sense out of all of this? Okay? So this is what we mean by decentralized governance in a way, or decentralized reputation, decentralized value distribution, public decision making, shared ownership, and so on and so forth. Another topic I want to mention briefly is that a lot of people are saying, calling this space the blockchain, but it's really misleading. We are really talking about distributed architectures. And blockchain is just one of them. Yes, I think it's the most fascinating out of them, and it's really, really powerful, but it's just one layer within a whole stack, a full stack of technologies that's going together. I just mentioned some names. For example, DHT, distributed hash table, is the bottom layer of that stack. It's what basically takes into account all the subjective stream of information. It's kind of the social network of that stack. Even there is peer-to-peer machine-based consensus, like BitTorrent if you want, versus peer-to-peer human-based consensus, what we call trust protocol. I trust you, or you trust me. It's a peer-to-peer trust protocol. Then there is the intersubjective or the subjectively objective protocol, which goes on the blockchain. And this is the reputation mechanism and all that. Eventually, at the top of the stack, you will also have a notion of a browser. In a way, it's a new kind of internet with a new kind of browser that will sit on top of it, which I can speak a lot about. But I'll just give you the title, and then if you're interested, just contact me later. But I would like to argue that we'll have to have, for this kind of technology, we'll have to have a new notion of browser, which we call the visual browser interface. So instead of browsing through links and clicks on links, just as you browse the internet or Wikipedia or Reddit, imagine that you're actually seeing the graph that is lying behind those links, and you actually in a visual manner, you browse the network through the graph itself. It gives you a better notion of context, which you will have to have in such a gigantic, while interacting with such a gigantic database. Another important thing to mention here is maybe the elephant in the room. I think many people are aware of that and also concerned about that, which is scalability. So blockchain is notoriously known to have a scalability problem, and a lot of people are concerned about that. My perspective on that is just the same kind of scalability problem that any technology that is entering the game has, just like the internet basically. And I would like to claim, or I would like to argue that it's in progress and it's evolving all the time. And within a decade, less than a decade, we'll have completely scalable technology. There are various ways to deal with scalability. Part of them is to put some of the information on the DHT layers rather than the blockchain. There are trees of blockchain solution. There is off-chain incentivized processes. There are random subset of verifiers and all that. I won't get into that, but if you are interested, just let me know. One important thing that I would like to emphasize when I speak about governance protocol is that it's very important to distinguish, at least potentially, between financial ownership and influential ownership. In a way, separate the asset, financial asset from the governmental asset. So this is one thing that we do when discussing governmental protocols. Another interesting feature, when you design distributed architecture, you find that there is a built-in tension between resilience, resilient objectivity. All of us were trying to hold an objective notion of something. So there is a built-in tension between resilience and scalability. In a way, it's because of the attention. Because to have resilience, you need a lot of attention put on every piece of information, right? If all of us now looking on the same piece of information, that's what makes information resilient. That's what makes it not easily hackable or tweakable. But the point is that if we all look on the same piece of information, it makes it very non-scalable. So there is a built-in tension always in all of this distributed architecture between resilient objectivity and scalability. And just in one or two words, the way to solve this kind of tension is through compositionality or fractalization or complexity. The idea is that the network itself is composite. It's not like a homogeneous network. It's more like nature works. It's a fractal, and that basically allows the stream of attention to move in a way which is kind of singing and dancing between objectivity and scalability. Maybe just really a few words about the Backfeed protocol. So basically, while in the blockchain we're talking about proof of work or proof of stake, in the Backfeed human protocol we're talking about proof of value, proof of reputation, proof of recognition, proof of consciousness. This is tied up strongly with reputation, notion of reputation, decentralized reputation, where here I would like to emphasize that reputation is not new to the blockchain. I mean, reputation exists in Amazon, reputation exists in stock exchange, reputation exists in eBay, and reputation exists in Google PageRank and algorithm, right? The way different webs evaluate each other. The point is, if you take those kind of ranking systems, reputation systems, and put them on decentralized technology, by definition they fail. They fail due to Sybil attacks of multiplicity of identities. So the whole decentralized topology requires a whole new notion of reputation. And this is the core technology of the Backfeed protocol. One thing to say is that when you evaluate contribution of others, you actually put in your reputation at stake. So if you evaluate badly, your reputation decreases. If you evaluate correctly, your reputation increases. It's a whole long story. It creates micro-alignment versus macro diversity. It's scalable, resilient, and so on. And there is also a question about whether we really need to separate the infrastructure layer from the governance layer. This is a big question that we're thinking of today. So let me just end this session by mentioning just some things that should go on the blockchain. I mean, this is just a random list. There are like hundreds of them. But basically, trivial thing that should go on the blockchain can be any possible registry process, accounting, banking. This should trivially be thrown on the blockchain. That's what actually happened today. Banking systems, accounting system, all of them are going on the blockchain. Then, of course, also monetary system and financial instrument. These are like goes without saying. Less trivial, but even more dramatical, that should go on the blockchain will be insurance. With today's technology and knowledge, there is no need for insurance company anymore. And I'm willing to gamble that in a decade we won't see them anymore. Journalism, media, publishing, lending, ride-sharing, ecological monitoring movement, renewable energy certificates, carbon credits. These can be issued by people and not by governments. And just really to end this session, let me just mention some funny things, just to show you how wide this scope is. Just some funny things that can go on the blockchain. So you can issue your own stock, basically your personal stock of your future earning, and sell them. You can IPO yourself on the blockchain. You can make authorities actually stand in their promises. They can actually say, if such and such will happen, we'll allocate such and such resources. They can actually do that on the blockchain, and they will have to stand in their promises. That might be interesting. You can design high organize according to speeds via economic incentives. In the Jewish tradition, there is this thing called kol ketubah. When the man marries a woman, there is an agreement, and he says how much he will pay if they get divorced. You can actually put that on the blockchain. That might be interesting. And finally, you can engineer AI strategies or artificial intelligence strategies and can let them compete. And then let the human layer is kind of the assessment layer that kind of chooses which strategies to compete with which strategies, and eventually get to a place where you have autonomous AIs that actually live for themselves. And sorry for just one more minute, a beautiful project of my colleague, Primavera de Filippi, which is called Plantoid. I have to tell you about that. I think this is the coolest project in the space. Plantoid for a plant is what Android for human. Okay, so she was being asked to make an artistic presentation of the blockchain. So what she has done, she and some other people, they made a beautiful sculpture, okay? And on this sculpture, with your phone, you can basically tip the sculpture with Bitcoins, okay? So you can tip it. Now, once there is enough Bitcoins in the wallet, the sculpture hires an artist to replicate itself. Okay? So the human beings are the pollinating bees for this existing autonomous sculpture. And in the contract of the hiring, it says what it can change and what it cannot change in the sculpture. And it also says, how much of the revenue stream back to the artist and so on. So you can actually test governance protocol with artistic representation. So let me end by that. Thank you.
All right, thank you to everyone. Do any of the panelists want to respond to anything?
I was sort of hoping you'd ask us some controversial questions or something.
I would actually love to hear some of the
I would love to hear some controversial questions from the audience as well. So I saw that hand in the blue first.
Yeah, great, thanks. Thank you very much. Very compelling set of discussions. I have too many questions, so I'm going to try and put it in a zip file and send it on to you, and maybe you can catch a little bit of it and respond. So one theme that comes up is fractals, right, and fractal geometry. And of course, this is very compelling because all of a sudden, if we're thinking about blockchain, making economic transactions on a blockchain, we're talking about a different type of economy, right? And all of a sudden, our metaphor is shifting. We're no longer talking about the growth of volume. Inflation must go such and such amount to keep up with such and such metrics. We're talking about a completely different set of metaphors. For instance, in fractal geometry, you talk about fitting infinite length to a finite space. And so we're dealing with a different set of economic metaphors already. But of course, as you well know, in the blockchain, in second generation blockchain, there's two tensions. This is really, I guess, the question that I want to pose to all of you, and I'd really be delighted to hear your feedback. On the one hand, we have, when it comes to dealing with finance and financial economics, we have the integration of the old financial model, right, onto the blockchain. Blind Masters goes and literally buys, that's right, buys a blockchain called Hyperledger, right? And has a faster time to market, cost negligence and all of that, right? That's the traditional financial sector now just integrated. And on the other hand, there's Ethereum, which I know Joel and Matan, you with Backfeed are interested in. You're like actually trying to wager on the integration of new economic models with blockchain, right? We have that tension going on here. Also in these talks, where we have on the one hand the metaphor of fractal geometry, which has a model of economy that's grounded in deterministic chaos, versus the equilibrium models that finance capitalism and capitalism more generally has always gone. So for instance, when I see these sort of pictures of a dynamical system that is non-anthropomorphic, you know who's the best, the most articulate at discussing this? Frederick Hayek. Right? So it's almost like we're discovering again these old economic debates on this new technology being presented to us in a new guise. And I just wanted to process that tension with you and just hear your really articulate feedback that you've already given us on blockchain.
One of the things I really like about the fractal geometry way is that first of all, I just don't care about the equilibrium model. I don't care about what Blythe Masters is doing. I don't care about just replicating the Wall Street system with blockchain. I think maybe there are advantages from a financial standpoint. I just personally don't care. But what I think is super interesting is that a lot of these things have these dynamics where it's, a lot like natural ecosystems, and one of the ones I like to use is mycelium, or kind of, these fungi systems or bacterial systems that effectively overlay, human systems. So you have all kinds of interesting organisms that are living inside of you and maybe even potentially live in some kind of symbiotic notion. And what this is it actually not such as a fractal, but it's kind of like a layered fractal, where it's like, here's the one system and we can layer something on top of it and something on top of it and something on top of it. And then the nice thing about that too is you're not directly competing with something, and there's not necessarily scarcity dynamics that come in. And then what you can do as a result is way cooler. And even on the note of Ethereum, I happen to know the founders of Ethereum relatively well, and they see, it's not about Ethereum as an alternate chain. It's about allowing, ultimately, and it's not this way today, but I think it will be, where anyone can have their own chains for anything, and they are all kind of dynamically interacting with each other. And I think that's like the true peer-to-peer vision. And it's taking a while because the technology takes a long time to develop and things like that. But when you get to that state, then, really, you're going to have a lot of really interesting dynamics, and that's what I'm excited about. So
I'm really excited to hear you say that, actually, because one of the things which maybe ties in with your question that I would wonder is that we do have these radically different versions of the blockchain that happening, and I kind of wonder, can we have some kind of pluralism, like the way we speak about maybe having different kinds of money today that do different things, or are we going to see some kind of network effects where basically it's the dominant blockchain or a dominant blockchain that kind of
pushes alternatives out. I'm really happy to hear you say that you think they're.
And I think there's no question that a lot of people want to replicate the systems that it currently exist and the kind of way that value capture happens in the current system in a blockchain system. Like a lot of people who are drawn there as entrepreneurs, have grown up in that type of system, and it's just their natural models is to do that. And for me, like the whole idea of swarms is like the total opposite. So, I just can't get interested in it. But
Well, for me, I think
but
that's
it's an issue.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
For me, I think that's the transition from oh, it doesn't work. That works.
Yeah.
So for me, that is the transition from a rigid system to a living system. I think we're just entering a new era where instead of having multiple agents which are completely separate from each other, we actually have humanity as a living system, which go through evolution, and I think giving rise to a higher order of intelligence. That's related crucially to the fractalization.
I'm having trouble to actually get I get the idea that for me there is something that which is I get the idea, but it's like it would be without constraints, and we have physical constraints, we have ecological constraints, we have many constraints of my shape, and so my question is. How is the power relates to blockchain? Because I am very reluctant to any idea of there is any human organization where there is not power involved. Like, for example, this, in theory, in assemblies, all of us are equal, but in practice, it's not, because the person who has more time to be there, the person who is more vocal, there is always a set of elements which concentrate the power and benefit some and prejudice others. So my question to you would be this one, like how is the points of power in the process for gaining influence, and who might get prejudiced by this type of system? Like, for example, the more marginal or the people with less resources might be more prejudiced, or how does this relate to gender? I mean, there is a whole set of political problems that I'm trying to deal with, in which it seems disappear in how you present it, and this is why I am reluctant to.
I completely agree with what you're saying, and that I think when this is, can you hear me? Okay, yeah. That the problem that we imagine the blockchain solving is like the neoliberal state with a big capital N. So it's some big imagined, like centralized intermediary that we want to remove. But as you're saying, there's all these other kinds of social relationships that are happening organizationally that aren't being imagined or brought into that. And I don't know what your guys' answer would be in terms of maybe design, because obviously you saw a massive centralization around Bitcoin that speaks to what you're saying, where we speak about that as being a peer-to-peer system, but the peers in that system aren't people, they're computers. So if you've got, more, not only that you have technological capital in terms of being able to use it, which is a whole other thing that's gendered, that's, class-based, it's educationally based, but also that you were able to invest in that, and then that it, it had a huge amount of energetic expenditure and things. But I'm kind of wondering if in these kind of blockchain 2.0 that people aren't stupid, they do understand that there are these problems, that this isn't utopian, that this isn't necessarily going to just happen straight away. So it seems like there are people considering how to maybe get around some of these problems.
So I think the important thing to emphasize is to distinguish between technology and agenda. I mean, blockchain doesn't have an agenda of freedom, or blockchain doesn't have an agenda of equality. Blockchain is just a technology. We people have agendas, and we can put whatever agenda we have, we can put on top of the blockchain. And just as right now Bitcoin has become more and more centralized, we can just have a blockchain that is less and less centralized. It's just about us to decide what kind of design we want to imprint into the blockchain. But the nice thing is that the blockchain is very naturally going together with an open source technology, which means that, well, it can also go with closed source maybe, but actually the blockchain is very naturally goes with open source technology, and the nice thing about that is that it doesn't matter if one person will imprint a bad design, someone else will imprint a good design, and eventually evolution will decide which design is better. So it's really important to distinguish between the agenda and technology. They really have very little to do with each other. Sorry?
You said evolution will measure.
Yeah, eventually, I mean.
Agendas often are what decide.
Well, I think the evolution will decide which of the agenda will win. But maybe one agenda will be fair and will win more support of the people, and then that's why it will win. I'm just saying that we can imprint whatever agenda we have, more centralized, less centralized, more fair, more communistic, more capitalistic. We can imprint whatever we want. Blockchain is just a technology that let us have coordination on a larger scale. That's it.
You want to respond to that?
I think it's a really hard question, so I don't have an answer to it. And there's so many different projects that are underway at the moment, and so many different agendas that are mixed in with them. And because we're early, it is difficult to know who's going to succeed. And there's the technological element, and then there's also even the regulatory element, in that some of the people who are early in Bitcoin and benefited a lot from Bitcoin are like kind of pushing for other things to be illegal that aren't Bitcoin, So then it's like it's like a very clear sort of power grab from that particular demographic. And I personally find that reprehensible, but that doesn't mean that someone like that won't win in some places. And yeah, so I don't know. I in some ways I'm optimistic in the long run, but I'm not necessarily optimistic, in even the 10-year range that it'll have that huge systemic change.
So I would claim that technologies are not without agendas. I don't know. You could claim that stock exchange is just a technology, and that we are guilty that we cannot use it properly, and that some other people have different agendas, and their agendas are winning and ours are losing. It's not true. It's like some technologies do have biases. For example, in the case of blockchain, it assumes that we are trusted as a society and build everything upon that. And for this context, this conference, I'm questioning: should we really be using technologies which base everything else is all designed on the assumption that we are trusted as a society? I don't think so. I think we should be building on different technologies which do take into account that we can trust some people.
But just to emphasize, blockchain doesn't assume that there is no trust in society. It just says that if you want to leverage trust in a digital way, you can, but it doesn't assume that. You can code into the blockchain any possible script, whether it's something that enhances trust or something else. So it's true that what I would agree with is that often technologies are biased with agendas that kind of naturally wrapping them, or just like just a shirt that people put on top of the technologies. That I agree with, but this is put manually by people. We can decide to put a different shirt on that technology.
How about design decisions made enabled technology was based on
That's
the
true.
trustless. So
That's true.
what are the design decisions you might choose different trade-offs if you would start with a different premise? And then it would behave maybe differently, and then you maybe have different results. Alright,
This feels like a nice line of conversation. Do you want to chime in at all?
I guess I don't totally agree with Matan that the technology is agenda-less. I think it's like a tool, and it does have embedded agendas of some kind, and there's a lot of. But the thing is, it's a fairly flexible tool that has a lot of different varieties. So, in that sense, like for an example, I'm not actually a huge lover of Bitcoin by any means, but like it's really hard to send money to the Ukraine, and I had to send money to Ukraine, and Western Union would charge like 10% and take like a week, and Bitcoin took like 10 minutes and charged nothing, So there are certain types of things where there's a whole bunch of trade-offs involved. And I don't know. I don't think there's any simple answer to that question. So, but I agree with kind of the general gist of what you're saying. So,
Yeah, well, I mean, I said, I suppose, at the end of my talk, my anxiety about the blockchain is that we can position it in a line of basically technologies for governmentality that are designed to maybe delegate, like to actually remove politics and replace that with economics, and that is my concern.
and And that's sort of why I put it in the context of earlier work like Eleanor Ostrom's work, because Eleanor Ostrom's work is on, commons and economic things and
I
creating
think
trust.
her work on commons is quite problematic in just that way, because she's imagining that the commons is made up of neoliberal subjects that are competing with each other. She's already starting from a position that has nothing to do with the commons. Like, the commons is a resource, and how are we going to, incentivize people to cooperate with each other through. I just find that quite problematic, and that's built into a lot of the blockchain imaginaries as well.
I've never heard that critique before, so I'm interested in pursuing it privately or whatever. So.
Can we make a conceptual clarification though here between technologies? Technology. We can talk about the Bitcoin protocol as a technology that, because of its proof of work consensus mechanism, does have an agenda.
Right.
But the
That I agree
blockchain,
with.
as Matan is talking about it, is like the digital equivalent of a stem cell. A stem cell has no agenda.
Exactly.
It can differentiate into different cells that then later have agendas. Each cell has a function. It has an agenda the way it's gonna go, that it's going to function. But a digital stem cell, why do scientists love digital stem cells? Because they can tinker on it to get it to do different things in different ways, right? It has 200 and some different ways that it can differentiate later on. So I think we need to make some conceptual clarification on what technology actually is in what incarnation.
One of the best authors on this is Kevin Kelly. I don't know who's familiar with him. I can tell that not everyone loves Kevin Kelly, but in one of his books was called What Technology Wants, and it was sort of arguing that certain things imply other things. And he also wrote pretty extensively about the topic of emergence and decentralized money system. So whether or not you agree with everything he says, he's probably the most prescient author on the topic.
All right, that looks like an important raised hand right there. Everyone wants you to speak. Can you stand up? Can you stand up if you're able?
Simple questions. One is well, Bitcoin is great for sending money to Ukraine or to the police through the embargo. For it to really scale to more than an infinitesimal percentage of world transactions, how problematic is proof of work, given the fact that no other system, not proof of stake, not proof of anything else, is viable? So, how much actual computational power are we going to use to make Bitcoin sustainable environmentally? And the other thing is in the Bitcoin blockchain, the value is the transaction itself. When you abstract that to contract systems, those make promises based on things that are outside of the blockchain. And in that kind of situation, how does enforcement work, and how do you deal with default without some sort of blockchain tools?
I personally think that the proof of work algorithm as it's currently designed is immensely wasteful and not sustainable, and even bad economics, like just good for bootstrapping and having an incentivization for the network in the beginning, and kind of terrible once you get into the 5-year plus range. So how that corrects or what kind of other consensus mechanism succeed it is a hotly debated topic, and I've read the high-level versions of a lot of different things, but not to the point where I'm confident to really say this is going to be the next thing.
So regarding the first question, I completely agree about the proof of work thing, that it's not viable, although it may be found out that eventually some bottom layer of proof of work on a small scale may actually support a larger scale of proof of something else. At the same time, I'm in close touch with the people that are today leading the efforts of developing proof of stake and other mechanisms. And while as I agree that we cannot yet judge whether we have a final solution or not, I think I would say people are rather confident that it's going to work. And regarding the second question, it's actually very interesting. So there are two kinds. So basically, the decentralized network is producing a new kind of value, new kind of service, new kind of product. In the case of Bitcoin, the service itself is the transaction. That's the service itself. In more generalized a version of decentralized organization, it's something else. And there are two kinds of transactions or services that are, you can categorize everything to two kinds of them. And one of them is the peer-to-peer service, another one is network-to-peer or peer-to-network services. Now the peer-to-peer service is very simple. The enforcement is just, so for example, take ride sharing. So the service is just a driver that is offering service to the rider, and the transaction is just automatically happens in the software. So that's what enforces, if you want, the payment without any police. The police, if you want, is just the software that everybody agree to play with. In the case of network-to-peer service, it's more subtle. This question is very important, and then in some cases it's more complicated to enforce than the others. And then it's a real issue that need to be resolved, basically. I'm not sure if it was answering your question. Okay,
Yeah,
so.
I think it's not the enforcement of the transaction, but the enforcement of a dispute about a transaction.
Well, but that can be coded. That can be coded into the protocol. So you can define in the protocol exactly what are the conditions under which you need to interfere with a third party or fourth party or external agents and so on to resolve disputes. Whatever you can code in software, you can code in blockchain, basically.
Well, what about things that you can't code in software?
Right. So whatever you cannot code. But is there anything? Even human judgment is something you can code in software, right? You can code. No, you can code in software the fact that these agents will interfere with their human judgment and add them into the system. There is nothing in reality today that is being used to solve disputes that you cannot code in the blockchain. You can cite that millions of people can say their judgment on that issue. Then algorithm will take those judgments and will make them an outcome. So there is no any logical process you can code basically, including human judgment.
There's a logical process.
I would actually
I think Sarah.
take something that you document and you see that it's really hard to code it.
I'm fascinated to hear what Sarah.
Let's hear this.
Okay, so I don't know if this is really a question or like I have an intuition about something. I'd like to hear what you think. So you were talking about resilience and scalability, and in some ways the answer being sort of like, I don't know what your terminology is, but like fractal organizing for lack of a good word. So put that in group one. No, group one. So now I'm thinking about how, as we fund almost everything in the world right now, there's just an overemphasis on private equity and venture capital, which what that does is looks for the thing that will create the most uniform experience, because then you can monetize it and distribute it. And the problem with that is that you get into the resilience problem because you're only having a small number of big things. And I think about a lot as the restaurant Pan Quotidian in New York. Like, it used to be great. There were like 2 of them. Now there's like 100, and it's just bad like everything else that goes to scale, in my opinion. So the question that I'm trying to figure out is there like something relevant in blockchain toward the idea of creating local types of fractal structures and a mechanism for crowdsourcing or something, so that really the truth is that at the end of the day, if you can't figure out an economic model to make something perpetuate itself, it doesn't perpetuate itself. So, do you get what I'm saying? No. So like what? So is there like a blockchain that is relevant for thinking about how people build local things that are more complex to the locality, that don't have this uniformity of scale, but that you could be creating platforms that stitch together the locality that enable a kind of uniformity of funding? Anyway, we're meeting later, we'll discuss. I don't know. I think there's something interesting because so many of these things tend to be uniformity around financial things that make these things happen that aren't biodiverse. And all of the examples that you think of that are cool of like, birds swarming, which like if I see another bird swarm, like, yay, that's wonderful. But don't human beings have a kind of swarming economic thing that we could be imagining how, like, cooperative 4.0, like, you know what I mean?
So I'm not sure if I give you the right answer. Please tell me. So stigmergy, swarming is about stigmergy, right? Which is kind of algorithm which is coded into the DNA of very simple agents, which basically build, it's an indirect coordination. So one agent is doing an action, and then this action triggers a mediating signal, and then this mediating signal then affects another agent, which triggers another action, all this is coded in a way which synchronize and build action on top of actions and create seemingly complex intelligent structures. Now this works in nature perfectly, but notice that it only works for simple agents. It works for bees, for ants, for birds, for fish. It doesn't work for elephants, for example. So in a way, it's actually relying on the fact that the agents are in a way egoless. They don't think about, how would I hack the system? If I just move a little bit to the right, I would actually probably benefit more. As a global community, the community will be optimized, but if I just step a little bit to the right, I will actually benefit more than my friends. So stigmergy, as it is in nature, is actually sensitive to this kind of logic, and that's why it only works for simple agents. The big question is how to imply stigmergy for complex agents like us, because we do think of how can I get better position if I just step to the right, and that's where the blockchain enters. In a way, about all of us agreeing about what are the rules of the game, and the rules of the game are binding us. And then also incentivizing us economically to be binding with the rules. So in that sense, blockchain is the added feature into simplistic stigmergy in order to work successfully for human beings. That's how I see that. I'm not sure if it's what you were asking.
I have a somewhat concrete example that we're potentially working on now that is very relevant, and that is the pot industry, and particularly in California. It's a black market still to this day. It's expected to become legal in 2016. And there's a lot of interesting work on how do you actually incentivize the local producers of high quality things to still be able to survive, when this industry kind of becomes more industrialized. And so far, there's been an immense interest in the blockchain technology as well, because they can see, and this is kind of what I was talking about a little bit in the stigmergy stuff as well, is that you can have dual track systems where there's some kind of embedded reputation that then enhances the financial value, and then those two things can kind of complement each other. And that actually, to some extent, potentially replicates those existing trust networks that you find even in black markets, where you're kind of going from one highly trusted party to another highly trusted party. It's still kind of early at this stage, but I hope we make something work. So,
it's kind of like building blockchain for solidarity.
Yeah.
Because in the short term, nobody has the incentive to stay together, but when you see something larger than yourself,
exactly.
you're like the Dutch with water. And so it's sort of how do we envision that?
Yeah.
Can you stand if you're able?
Yeah. My question is about the design of the decentralized systems in general. We talk about an open democratic system all the time, which is not really true for many reasons. And one reason I think is network effects that we discussed briefly here. When people move first to a market, let's say, you for example, Facebook, Uber, stuff like that, or in the post-Cold War era, when these countries like Turkey, Poland, Chile, when they open their markets, new companies come in and then they disrupt their markets, so on and so forth. So first mover advantage, and when you first build your network, you have really big power. And I wonder if you have any design, say, ideas or solutions about this issue within this scale of networks.
Well, at least from my perspective, I would say that, and again, this is maybe these are guiding principle to build further technology, but in a way to allow for maximal flexibility, maximal liveliness in a way, so that, for example, if you want to counterbalance the network effect, what you would like to do, and this is very aligned with the blockchain because everything is transparent, what you would like to do is to have forkability with zero cost, close to zero cost. So if there is a network effect generated around one branch, but then you can just, as simple as clicking a button, fork it to another branch, and since the whole database of users is actually accessible to both branch, then you just in a way counterbalance the network effect. So I would say the design principle, guiding principle would be liveliness, flexibility, fluidity, openness, transparency, and so on. And I think these are very, very aligned with the abilities of blockchain. So I'm quite optimistic about this.
I sort of disagree with Matan on that one. Partially on just the business model side, it's like sometimes the more open it is, the harder it is to capture value, and then kind of like we were talking about a little bit this morning, the harder it is to find finances to put back into building the technology that makes it accessible or allows other people to get access to it. So,
so we have diversity of opinions. That's good.
In the back.
Yeah, I just want to bring it back to what Maya was talking about. The technology is neutral or not. You have your labor, right? So just thinking of like how this conference kind of started with the digital labor summits that began a lot of these discussions and relationships. In other disciplines, in anthropology and psychology, those labor groups, discipline groups, are saying, should we allow people to practice, if they support torture? So likewise, as in computer science, data ethics usually clears the room, right? But I feel like a lot of the questions that have come up are this question of ethics, of, you mentioned morality, whatever word we want to choose, but it's what is the spec that we're working on? Because a lot of the default assumptions in a lot of the tech circles are radically libertarian in all sorts of different formulations, but that isn't necessarily what I think Maya was looking for when she's talking about how can we better live together in a city. So what about how do we deal with data ethics? How do we get beyond the sort of expert, siloed, super narrow discussions and get to these deeper issues?
I just want to check to understand the question, because I feel like there's two things maybe. So one was that how do we move beyond sort of the common denominator of kind of a very libertarian?
Well, I mean, so.
Or how specifically do we deal with data?
About the sort of spec on this sort of meaning, political, ethical level of what is it that we're trying to, when we say open, when we say democratic, which for who, right? So that isn't really talked about so much, but we drill down into what a technology can or can't do, and it's like in search of it's like there's a technology, what should we do with it? That is okay, we need freedom for that, but if it's only that, we kind of end up in this sort of like dog chasing its tail conversation going nowhere.
Is that that's what this conference is about, though, isn't it? About trying to open up those conversations and move beyond, like you're saying, to some kind of swap solution without a problem to maybe problematizing some of that. Well, I don't know if that's a solution, but it's a start, I guess.
I mean, in these other disciplines, they're actually, like in psychology, there's a battle to say, can practitioners, can we as a group of people exercising labor in universities and whatnot, can you be called a psychologist if you are helping the army design torture regimes? So where's the parallel in, technology? I think that's a question that we should think about, because we keep stumbling on these profound ethical questions, but there isn't a similar.
So I think one of the challenges there is kind of what you're talking about. It's a very flexible tool, and I happen to know many of the architects of the more complex systems. And for instance, Vitalik, who's the sort of inventor of Ethereum, and I've had some very intense and kind of long conversations about political things. And I know both his sort of libertarian reading list and his sort of like, other types of like liberal reading lists. And he, went to see David Friedman and talk with him, as Milton Friedman's son, and he also wrote an exposition of Piketty's work and how it relates to the crowd sale that Ethereum did and the actual income distribution. And generally speaking, those represent pretty ideologically diverse viewpoints. And I think part of what draws some people is that it's kind of like an open playing field at the moment in which you can experiment with any model. And even like very obscure thinkers like Silvio Giselle, I don't know if people know his ideas about free money, like that there's now like, you know, large blockchain implementations of like demurrage systems. So will they work? I mean, I don't know, but it's like a total, like if you were trying to force some ideological coherence among these people, you couldn't even do it because it's just so many different strands.
So just to add on that, I mean, just to emphasize how flexible this system is, it's not only that people are now playing with strategies, but any strategy that anyone would like to play with would take place at some point. So that's very different from, for example, Facebook or social networks. It's a new technology, but this new technology, once the network effect was created, was kept until this very day in a silo. So I cannot play with the governance protocols, algorithms of Facebook, even if I think that I have much better algorithm, right? In the blockchain, it's really different because everything is open source, and while as one set of people will play around with one set of values and governance system, another set of people will play with another governance system. So eventually, any sort of idea or ideology or agenda or governance system or set of values eventually will be coded. And then it's just about the people to decide which governance system or set of values to play with and which not.
I feel like there's been loads of talk of elephants in the room at Platform Cooperativism for some reason. Sorry, I haven't thought about how I'm going to say this, but I feel like the elephant in the room here is maybe that we all recognize that maybe there are limitations in terms of, because there's particular groups of people designing for the blockchain and there's particular interest there, and so even though we say maybe that potentially we can design anything, and then the most, we can design any, it's neutral, it's flexible, it's just a computer language, and all that's true on one hand. Then on the other hand, obviously that we need to understand what kinds of like social, political conditions are actually driving those technologies, and that those aren't kind of evenly maybe distributed.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so that's what it kind of seems to me. I guess I'm just kind of continuing the same line of conversation. It seems like at the end of the day, like, in terms of like World Wide Web, a lot of the stuff you talk about in terms of blockchain sounds like stuff you can do now. Just the verification without like a centralized verification is a little bit harder. So to me, it's like the primary application is like the ability to identify. I think in terms of the overall transactions, it seems to be like probably set up. And I'm new to blockchain, so I'm just kind of spitballing here. But it seems like you can probably set up things locally, like local trust centers, like a lot easier with blockchain or whatever, and then kind of handle like the excess volume of transactions by enabling kind of like more regional trust centers. I mean, if one becomes problematic, like the ability to build a new one would be a lot easier. But I mean, at the end of the day, like, we're still going to have to get to a point where, so that's the one piece. But the other thing is kind of like where we're going to go in terms of overall standards. And I think it does. It comes down to basically like our overall ethics in how we design it, because we're never going to get to a point where everybody's going to equally be able to design systems. So we're always going to be still kind of dependent upon people who design systems to implement the egalitarian pieces. I mean, or maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think I haven't gotten necessarily how to make it so that people who don't code can now be in an egalitarian structure. There's always kind of that experience. Whatever system you have, somebody who's good at using that system is going to be more powerful than people who don't know how to use that system. You guys are all way more powerful blockchain than me, because I'm just now like kind of exploring it.
Can I ask a question?
So I think that's inherent in systems of power. I think we're trying to use that also. So there's that, and then I also kind of want to see how blockchain is different in terms of, because a lot of stuff we've been talking about, like in terms of the abilities and things you can do. When you do presently with information technology, it just sounds like it might be a lower like lower hill to climb to get to it.
Well, I don't know, sorry if there's, do you want to, maybe, there was a question I kind of wanted to dovetail onto that, maybe for these guys, but maybe you have an answer. I guess I'm really curious about the trade-offs in some of the blockchain stuff between user interfaces and then a deep understanding of what's actually happening. And I was curious as developers how you felt about that. So on the one hand, I went to kind of Ethereum developing workshops in Berlin last year, and it was just completely over my head, and it just felt like this is so clunky. I mean, this is early on as well, but just it's so difficult that who's actually going to be build. I was kind of curious, like who can actually build this stuff, and how much is this being closed off then to anyone who's not like super nerd to actually build an application. And so it seemed like they, we really need some kind of we need people to design user interfaces, which is why it's really great to see things like Backfeed, But at the same time, sometimes some of the user interfaces I've seen, then they almost obfuscate what's happening. So I saw one that was showcased recently called MoneyGraph, which is allowing artists to license their work. And it's a really simple user interface, just a couple of different icons, and you kind of group them together to produce different sorts of Creative Commons kind of licenses, basically. And which is great, obviously, because it means that your mother can, license a photo if she wants to. But at the same time, it's you've no idea what's actually going on. Okay, from looking at these images of like smiley faces and things that you put together, you don't really know what's actually going on. So it's like a trade-off. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, I think those two, of course, correlated concerns are completely at place. And I don't know, for me, that's the challenge. The challenge is, on one hand, to distribute knowledge as much as possible to allow for diversity of opinions to be affecting the process itself. And I think that happens. And at the same time, to every moment to look for the right balance between UX and accuracy, in a way. But I think this is a very natural process. I mean, I think the same kind of questions in the same kind of process people were gone through when making the internet, right? I mean, the internet in the early days, I'm sure, was completely inconceivable for most of, like, 99% of the population. And gradually it was built, like, very rough layers, and then less rough layers, and less rough layers, and more friendly layers. And until at some point, eventually, all of us can participate in the game. Maybe some more, some less, but...
What worries me is we already seem to need intermediaries to do, those things. So then you have this new layer of trust and new kinds of centralization at this prototyping stage even. So that's I don't know, that's kind of worries me a little bit in terms of how is anybody ever, going to be able to
Well, at least here we have one advantage on previous use cases, which is transparency. At least we know that everything is transparent. It's true. Sometimes we need to rely on professionals, but then we can rely as many professionals as we want, and we can always, if there is disagreement, we can always look at the things and agree about the stuff that we see. So in a way, I think we're in an even slightly better position than previous revolutions. But I agree. These are concrete and justified concerns.
Okay. We have 7 minutes left, so maybe 2 more.
I kind of want to talk. You mentioned the beginning of the internet, and that's roughly 20 years ago with the World Wide Web. What do you see, speaking on like horizons as part of this conference? What is something you see from the blockchain that's going to be out there in 20 years? Like, what are the kids that are growing up today going like? What is your just like fantasy of the blockchain, or maybe an aspect of it?
Can it be a dystopian fantasy?
Utopian or dystopian?
It seems today like what we're going to see is a lot of private blockchains used for things like automatic credit clearing, or that seems to be the trend, and also potentially maybe new kinds of digital rights management. And I'd love to think that we're going to see loads of other more socially beneficial applications. But all the questions that are being raised in the room are questions I have, and I'm not sure what the answer is, but maybe that's what platform cooperativism is for.
I guess I'm much more optimistic. I actually think that we have no clue what all will look like in 20 years. I actually believe we are standing in front of singularity that will really reshape humanity in such a dramatic way that it's impossible to actually imagine it. But I think that once we get systematic correlation and correlation functions in physicists, I haven't presented myself, but I'm a physicist, and once we see systematic correlation functions on a large scale of humanity, I think we'll actually be a phase transition, and I can imagine how the whole corporate system is completely replaced by gigantic network that are self-organizing. If you really take it to the extreme, I can see how basically government are becoming completely irrelevant, and corporations or any sort of centralized authority. What are the consequences of that? I don't know. It's hard to imagine, but I think it will completely reshape every portion of economy, society, social structure, culture.
Yeah, on that note, I do have a lot of dystopian ideas myself, but one that's not dystopian. It is just along those lines. I think so much of human progress has actually been driven by these cycles of violence and kind of like, these conflicts, like the evil empire versus the force of democracy. And for whatever reason, that's something that's like, to a certain degree, been a common pattern that reoccurs in human history. And I really think that one of the things that we can design here is systems that do really promote the behaviors that go beyond these systems of scarcity and then create these like cascading cycles of violence. So I also just see that as one of like the key needs. I mean, obviously Paris is in everyone's minds today. And I just think like, we kind of have to build something like that to just keep humanity going in the right direction. So.
One more question. Who's got the most burning one? You do. All right.
Thank you guys for your participation. I really got a lot of from what you had to say. My question is about code literacy, which we kind of touched on earlier. I was hired as an office. Can you guys hear me?
No.
My question is about code literacy, which we touched on earlier. And I work as an office manager, and it might seem like something that doesn't require coding, but it eventually did. For me to do the job even moderately competently. I just know Visual Basic a little bit, and that just it's impossible for me to do my job. Now, in my view, I think people will have to have code literacy in the future. I don't think that can be escaped. I think we've tried to escape it in many ways. So I want to know, first of all, do you agree? And second of all, how do you get to the point where you have the kind of code literacy that empowers people to be truly effective participants in these platforms that you're talking about?
Start young is actually, I think, the most important thing. So
get them while they're young,
and make it fun. So I've seen some really cool projects along those lines. In fact, someone in our collaborative living house is an ex-hip-hop artist, or actually sort of still a hip-hop artist, who has a cool like rhythm app that he's building on the side. But his day job is doing, UX design to teach children, science and kind of math through like fun, interactive kind of things. And I actually think that's like one of the great challenges is certainly that one, but it's there's ways that we can do it for sure.
Yeah, I think code literacy is really, really important, and the same kind of I have this is going to make me sound really Irish. I have 17 nieces and nephews. My godchild Lana is 10, and she's really, really into coding. So I used to teach Arduino, so she's into kind of makey, which is kind of physical computing, and really into coding. And you can tell as well she feels it's kind of cool now as well, that way. And she feels kind of empowered, and like she's a bit of a Harry Potter, doing her coding, and her teenage older sisters can't do it. So I just think, like that, these just programs for kids are amazing. And I actually think they will be much more code literate.
I mean, I really don't know. I mean, I'm not even sure about that. I myself, I'm not a software developer. I can read a little bit of code and write it if it's really, really simple. But I think we're going there anyway. So I don't know. When I got the first time to Twitter, I actually thought it's a code, like all these, these symbols. In a way, you are writing almost in a logical code fashion. So I think it's just entering our, our culture in one way or another. So it's, to some extent, I think we're going there anyway, without even trying.
All right. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Alternative Currencies Workshop is next in U204 if you're interested.
Okay,